The new CEO had been in the building 11 days when he called my department bureaucratic scar tissue. 9 months later, a federal inspector froze his $38 million contract using a paragraph I'd helped write back when he was still flipping warehouse companies. I want to tell you how that happened because people keep calling it revenge, and it wasn't. It was gravity. My name is Vance. I'm 54 years old, and for 13 years I was Director of Quality and Chief Inspector at Brazos Aero Group, an FAA-certificated repair station out by Meacham Field in Fort Worth, Texas. If you've flown on a regional jet anywhere in the southern United States, there's a decent chance an airframe we touched carried you over my house. We did heavy maintenance checks, structural repair, component overhaul. 340 employees. Hangars big enough to swallow a 737 and still have room for the tooling carts. People outside aviation hear quality department and picture a guy with a clipboard slowing everything down. Inside aviation, the quality department is the reason the wings stay attached. Every repair station in this country operates under Part 145 of the Federal Aviation Regulations, and the heart of that certificate is a manual. Ours ran 600 pages that names the people responsible for airworthiness decisions and spells out exactly how every inspection gets performed, documented, and signed. I didn't inherit that manual. I built it. I rebuilt it actually after the mess in 2012, which I'll get to, because the whole story turns on what happened in 2012. I held an airframe and power plant certificate I'd earned at 22, an inspection authorization I'd renewed every 2 years since, and the kind of relationship with our local flight standards district office that you can't buy, hire, or fake. When the FAA's principal maintenance inspector came through our hangars, she asked for me by name. Her name was Lorraine Babcock, 26 years with the agency, and she had a habit of running her hand along a wing skin like she was checking a horse for heat. Lorraine had seen everything twice. You did not perform for Lorraine. You showed her the records and let the records talk. I need to tell you about my situation at home, because it's the reason I sat quietly through things I might otherwise have walked out on. 14 months before any of this started, my wife Margot was diagnosed with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. Stage 3. She was 51. She'd spent 20 years teaching 7th grade science, and she found the lump herself on a Sunday night and said, in the same voice she used to tell me we were out of coffee, "I think this is going to be a thing." It was a thing. Chemotherapy, then a targeted antibody treatment her insurance fought us on for 2 months, then radiation. Our daughter was a sophomore at Texas A&M on a partial scholarship that didn't cover housing. Between Margot's reduced hours, the out-of-pocket maximums we hit by March 2 years running, and a tuition payment every semester, we were pulling from savings at a pace I tracked on a spreadsheet I never showed her. My health insurance, the good plan, the one that covered her oncologist at UT Southwestern, came through Brazos. I could not afford pride. I want you to remember that, because everything I did slowly and carefully, the way you move around a jack stand holding up 40 tons. The company got sold in February. Our founder was 78, and his kids wanted cash, not hangars, and the buyer was a private equity firm out of Dallas called Ironbart Capital Partners. Ironbart's pitch deck, somebody in finance leaked it around, described Brazos as an under-optimized platform asset in a fragmented MRO market. I had to ask my daughter what a platform asset was. She said, "It means they think y'all are a Lego piece, Dad." The new CEO arrived in April. His name was Pierce Lockhart, 46, and his background was logistics roll-ups. He'd spent a decade buying trucking and warehouse companies, squeezing them, and selling the squeezed version. He'd never worked a day in aviation. At his first all-hands meeting, standing on a lift platform in Hangar 2 with a wireless microphone, he told 300 people that Brazos had world-class hands and last-century overhead, and that his job was to find the bureaucratic scar tissue and cut it out so the muscle can move. I was standing next to my deputy, Dawn Kessler, when he said it. Dawn had been with me 9 years, came up as a sheet metal mechanic before moving into inspection, and she was the best records auditor I'd ever worked with. She didn't look at me. She just said, very quietly, "He means us." I wrote the phrase down that night in a notebook I keep. Bureaucratic scar tissue. I underlined it. Here's the thing about scar tissue that a logistics guy wouldn't know. It forms where something tore. Every page of our 600-page manual existed because somewhere, at some point, in our shop or somebody else's, something tore. In 2012, before my time as director, Brazos had torn badly. A return to service horizontal stabilizer with an improperly documented repair. Caught, thank God, during a pre-flight at the operator, not at altitude. The FAA's investigation found systemic record-keeping failures, and Brazo signed a consent agreement with the agency. Civil penalty, partially suspended, mandatory restructuring of the inspection department, and conditions that survive the settlement, enhanced surveillance, special reporting, and one provision in particular that lived in a binder in my office and in the certificate file at the Fort Worth FSDO. Any change to the individual serving as accountable manager or chief inspector required written notification to the FAA with the proposed replacement's qualifications, and the agency's review before the change took effect, over and above the standard rule that already requires repair stations to report management changes within days. The agreement had no expiration date, it said, until released in writing by the administrator. Nobody had ever asked for the release because asking invites a look, and you don't invite a look you don't need. I'd spent 13 years operating inside that agreement the way you live inside a house, so long you stop seeing the walls. Lockhart, I would eventually learn, did not know the walls existed. Ironbark's due diligence had flagged the 2012 enforcement action as resolved legacy matter, immaterial. Somebody billing $1,100 an hour wrote that sentence. The warning signs started in May. Lockhart began holding what his people called velocity sessions, strategy meetings with production, sales, and finance. Quality was not invited, Don found out from the hangar floor, because production supervisors came out of those meetings repeating phrases like, inspection cycle time is a controllable cost. When I raised it with Lockhart's chief of staff, a young man who wore a fleece vest in a Texas June, I was told the sessions were commercially focused, and my function would be looped in at implementation. Looped in at implementation. In a repair station, the quality department is not looped in. The quality department is the loop. The certificate exists because the FAA trusts that nothing leaves the building without passing through us. I said that more politely in an email. I got back a calendar invitation for a meeting 6 weeks out, which was later moved and then moved again. Then came the nephew. His name was Tanner Lockhart, 28 years old. Pierce's brother's kid, which everybody knew within a week, even though his title, Senior Director of Operational Excellence, was constructed to obscure it. Tanner had a marketing degree from SMU and 3 years at a consulting firm that helped e-commerce companies shave seconds off warehouse pick times. He had his uncle's easy confidence and his uncle's way of nodding before you finished a sentence. Like the nod was a forklift moving your words out of his path. He showed up in June and started touring the hangars with an iPad, photographing our inspection stamps and asking mechanics how long things took. In July, Tanner sat in on our quarterly meeting with the FAA, the surveillance briefing that the 2012 agreement required and that I had led personally for 13 years. He didn't observe, he participated. At one point, walking Lorraine Babcock through a slide, he referred to our required inspection items, the RIE list, the items so critical that federal regulation demands a second qualified set of eyes, as our double-check redundancies that we're evaluating for streamlining. The room went quiet in a very specific way. Lorraine looked at Tanner for about 3 seconds. Then she looked at me. I said, "What Mr. Lockhart means is that we're reviewing the RIE process documentation for clarity. The item list itself is established under a manual and isn't subject to streamlining." Lorraine made a note. She has a small leather portfolio, and she writes in it with a mechanical pencil. And in 13 years, I had learned that the mechanical pencil coming out meant a sentence had just been filed somewhere permanent. After the meeting, in the parking lot, she stopped next to my truck. She didn't say anything about Tanner. She said, "Curtis, how's Margot doing?" I said the scans in August would tell us. She nodded and said, "You take care of yourself," in a tone that contained an entire second conversation, and got in her government sedan and left. In September, Pierce Lockhart called me to his office for what his assistant's invite called a structural alignment conversation. He had taken the founder's old corner office and replaced the photographs of airplanes with a whiteboard covered in boxes and arrows. He was standing at the window when I came in, looking out at the ramp, and he let me stand there for a moment before he turned around, which is a move I assume they teach at some seminar, because I've now had it done to me by 3 different executives, and they all hold the pose the same length of time. He told me the company was creating a new role for me, Vice President of Regulatory Affairs, a raise, a seat at the velocity sessions. My deep institutional knowledge would be leveraged at the strategic level, and the day-to-day quality organization, the inspectors, the records, the manual, The chief inspector designation would transition to Tanner, who would bring, and I am quoting the man directly, fresh eyes to a function that's been run the same way for a long time. Fresh eyes on an inspection department at a repair station operating under a consent agreement that this man had demonstrably never read. I'd been expecting some version of this conversation since the all hands in April, and I had decided months earlier exactly how I would behave when it came. I asked thoughtful questions. I said the words transition planning several times. I asked for time to review the details, and Pierce smiled and said, "Take a couple weeks," and the smile was the smile of a man crossing an item off a list. I smiled back. I imagine my smile looked agreeable. What it was the smile of a man who knows the load path of a structure that another man is about to start on Bolton. That evening I called Gus Marchetti from my truck in the parking lot, with the engine running and the AC fighting the September heat. Gus spent 22 years at the FAA, the last 9 as a principal inspector, before he retired and hung out a shingle as a Part 145 consultant. Gus is also the man who sat across the table from Brazos in 2012 and helped draft the consent agreement from the government side. When he retired, our founder hired him to make sure we never needed another one. Gus knows where every bolt in the regulatory airframe lives, which ones are structural, and which ones hold the whole wing on. Gus, I said, hypothetical. A repair station operating under a continuing consent agreement replaces its chief inspector without prior written notification to the agency. What happens? He was quiet long enough that I could hear his television in the background. Then the television turned off. "Nobody's released that agreement," he said. It wasn't a question. Nobody has ever asked. Who's the replacement? A 28-year-old operational excellence consultant. No A&P, no IA, no Part 65 certificate of any kind. He has never held a wrench for money. Gus exhaled the way a man exhales when someone shows him a photograph of a cracked spar. Then he walked me through what I already knew, because I needed to hear someone else say it out loud. The chief inspector at a certificated repair station has to meet federal qualification minimums, certificated under Part 65, with years of hands-on maintenance experience, the ability to read and apply airworthiness data, all of it spelled out in black-letter regulation. That part alone disqualified Tanner before breakfast. But the consent agreement made it worse. The agreement converted what would normally be a 5-day after-the-fact notification into a prior review requirement. Skip it, and Brazos wasn't just making a bad hire. It was violating a written agreement with the administrator, which would land on the desk of the regional office with a flag on it, and the regional office would respond the way the agency always responds to a surveillance condition violation at a station with prior enforcement history: an immediate, comprehensive off-schedule inspection of the entire certificate. Records, training files, tooling calibration, everything. And while that inspection ran, every pending application the company had filed with the FAA would sit. Not denied, just sitting, deferred, frozen in the amber of supervisory caution. "Why are you asking, Curtis?" Gus said. "Succession planning," I said. "I believe in orderly transitions." There was a pause, and then Gus laughed, just once, like a cough. "You know Babcock got promoted in the spring. She supervises the certificate management team for your whole district now." "I know, Lorraine." "Then you know she reads everything." "I'm counting on it." Here's what I knew that Pierce Lockhart did not, because he attended the board meetings where it was discussed, and I attended the meetings where it was filed. Ironbark's entire investment thesis for Brazos rested on one deal. Transgulf Airways, a regional carrier flying 90-some jets out of Houston and New Orleans, was outsourcing its heavy maintenance, and Brazos was the finalist. $38 million over 5 years, with options that could double it. But Transgulf flew a fleet type we weren't yet rated for, which meant the deal was contingent on the FAA approving an amendment to our repair station certificate, an additional rating, plus approval of a satellite facility and a leased hangar on the other side of the field. Both applications had been filed in August. Both were sitting at the Fort Worth FSDO in the queue under the eyes of the certificate management team. The Rain Babcock's team, the contract had a drop-dead clause. If the certificate amendments weren't approved by the end of the second quarter of the following year, Transgulf could walk and take its committed volume to a competitor in Alabama. Pierce had told the board the FAA piece was administrative. I know he used that word because a board member repeated it to me later with an expression like he was holding spoiled milk. I should mention the board member because he matters. His name was Cyrus Quibble, 69 years old, 4,000 hours, in the left seat of airline jets before he moved into airline management. The only person on the new Ironbark-appointed board who had ever filed a flight plan. In October, at the meeting where Pierce presented the quality reorganization, Cyrus asked one question. Had the FAA been consulted about the change in chief inspector? Pierce said personnel decisions were internal matters and the regulatory function would be fully informed at the appropriate stage. Cyrus said on the record that he wanted his objection minuted. They minuted it and moved to the next agenda item. I know all this because minutes are kept, and eventually, minutes get read by people you'd rather hadn't. Through October and November, I did 3 things, and I did them with the patience of a man torquing fasteners in sequence. First, I assembled my professional archive. 13 years of manual revisions with my signature in the approval block. Every FAA correspondence file. Every audit. The complete documented history showing that the Brazos quality system was, in the agency's own surveillance language, directly attributable to the sustained leadership of the current chief inspector. This wasn't sabotage and it wasn't theft. Every page of it was my own work product and the station's official record, which stayed exactly where federal regulation required it to stay. What I built was an index, a map of what existed so that nothing could later be misrepresented to me or about me. Second, I watched Tanner work, and what I watched would have been funny if the airplanes weren't real. He hired a consulting friend to build something he called the Quality Intelligence Dashboard, a software layer that rolled our inspection records up into executive graphics. Green dials, trend arrows. He presented it at a velocity session as the future of audit readiness, the idea being that when the FAA came, we'd show them the dashboard instead of drowning them in paper. Dawn came into my office afterward, shut the door, and sat down like her knees had quit. He told the room, she said, that examiners appreciate synthesis, that they don't want to dig through work orders. And when Lorraine's team asks for the source records behind a dial, I said, the signed-off task cards, the RIE second signatures, the calibration certs? He says the dashboard links to them. Does it? She looked at me. The links work about 60% of the time. A 60% dashboard presented to federal airworthiness inspectors at a station under a consent agreement by a chief inspector with no mechanic's certificate. I want to be honest with you about what I felt in that moment, because the comments on stories like this always argue about it. I did not feel glee. I felt the specific cold dread of a man watching someone stack pallets in front of a fire exit. And underneath the dread, yes, a kind of clarity. Because I no longer had to wonder whether the structure would hold without me, I was being shown in advance exactly how it would fail. Third, I took a phone call I had been declining for 5 years. Maeve O'Donnell ran an aviation safety and certification consultancy out of Dallas. 40 people, blue-chip client list. The firm operators call when the FAA letter shows up and the general counsel starts sweating. Maeve had tried to recruit me twice. Both times I'd said no, because Margot's treatment made the insurance gap terrifying and because, honestly, I thought Brazos was mine to protect. In November, I called her instead. We met at a barbecue place in Roanoke, and before the brisket arrived, she slid a folded sheet of paper across the table with a number on it, and the number was 30% more than I was making, and the benefits package. I'd checked this before anything else. I am not ashamed to tell you, covered Margot's oncologist in-network. I'd want to bring Dawn Kessler, I said. I was going to ask why you hadn't said that already. And I need a start date in late February. There are notification requirements around my departure that have to be handled exactly right. They take time. Maeve has been in this industry 30 years. She looked at me for a moment and something behind her eyes did the math and she smiled into her iced tea and said, "Take all the time the regulations require, Curtis." In early December, Pierce announced the timeline internally. Tanner would assume the chief inspector designation effective February 1 with the manual revision, the page that names the chief inspector, the page the FAA holds a controlled copy of, to be processed administratively afterward. The annual surveillance inspection required by our agreement was scheduled for late March. The Transgulf certificate amendments were pending. Pierce was, in effect, planning to swap out the one human being the federal government had spent 13 years learning to trust, install an unqualified relative in violation of a standing agreement, and then welcome inspectors into the building 6 weeks later. You could not design a cleaner demolition sequence if you hired engineers. I submitted my resignation on a Friday morning in January. Not to Pierce, not to Human Resources. My resignation went out through Gus Marchetti, acting as my designated representative, delivered simultaneously to Brazos's accountable manager, as a professional courtesy, and directly to the Fort Worth Flight Standards District Office. Attention of the certificate management team, citing by section and paragraph the notification provision of the 2012 consent agreement. The letter stated that Curtis Vance, designated chief inspector, would separate from the company effective March 14th, providing more than the required notice, and because the agreement required the company to identify the proposed successor with qualifications, and because the company had already announced the successor internally in writing, the notification attached the announcement. Tanner Lockhart, Senior Director of Operational Excellence, Bachelor of Business Administration, Southern Methodist University. 3 years, e-commerce fulfillment consulting. 8 months at a repair station. Certificates held under Part 65 of the Federal Aviation Regulations, none. I did not editorialize. There was nothing to editorialize. The facts were a finished assembly. All I did was deliver it with the safety wire installed. Lorraine Babcock's office responded in 3 business days. The letter to Brazos's accountable manager and board ran 5 pages, and I'll summarize it the way it was eventually summarized to me. The agency acknowledged the chief inspector notification. It noted that the proposed successor did not appear to meet the minimum qualification requirements for the position under Part 145, and requested a complete qualification submission within 30 days. It announced that, in light of the proposed change in required management personnel at a certificate holder with continuing surveillance conditions, the FSDO would conduct an immediate special emphasis inspection of the repair station certificate. And, 4th page, 2nd paragraph, it stated that action on the pending certificate amendment applications, the additional rating and the satellite facility, was deferred pending resolution of the management qualification and surveillance review. Deferred. The $38 million contract's entire critical path now ran through a frozen queue. My phone rang 9 times that Friday afternoon. I was at the kitchen table going through Maeve's benefits enrollment paperwork with Margot, who had a scarf on her head and a highlighter in her hand, and was finding errors in the dependent coverage form like she was grading lab reports. I let the calls go. The voicemails, when I listened to them Sunday night, were a time-lapse of a man's education. The first was brisk. Curtis, call me back, we've got a process question. The 4th had lost the briskness. The 7th, left at 9:40 p.m., contained a long pause in the middle, and in the pause you could hear ice moving in a glass. I went in Monday because I owed 7 more weeks of notice and I intended to work every one of them properly. Pierce was waiting in the hallway outside my office. He had not shaved well. He followed me in, closed the door, and stood in front of my desk, not at the window, not posing, just standing, the way men stand when the seminar moves run out. The Trans-Gulf Amendments, he said. Legal says the FAA can hold them indefinitely. There has to be a mechanism to expedite. There's a process, I said, and I gave it to him straight, because I was still his employee and giving it straight was the job. Retain outside aviation regulatory counsel that morning, not next week. Respond to the qualification request honestly, which meant conceding that the proposed successor was not qualified, because the agency already knew and the only thing left to lose was credibility. Withdraw the Tanner designation. Demonstrate continuity. A qualified interim chief inspector with a real Part 65 history in the seat before the special emphasis inspection began. Do all of that flawlessly, I said, and the deferral might lift in a quarter, maybe 2. The contract window closes June 30th. I'm aware of the contract window. He looked at the wall behind me where I kept one photograph, the 2014 surveillance closeout meeting. Our team and the FAA team. Everyone in that stiff group photo posture. Lorraine Babcock second from the left. He looked at it for a while. What would it take to keep you through June, he said. Name it. Title, equity, a completion bonus. Name the number. And there it was. I'd wondered for months what I'd feel when this exact sentence arrived. Because I knew it would arrive. Desperation always offers money. Because money is the only wrench. Desperation owns. What I felt was tired. Pierce, I said, in April you stood on the lift in Hangar 2 and called my department bureaucratic scar tissue. I want you to know the FAA has a different name for it. They call it the basis of your certificate. The scar tissue was the certificate. You cut it, and now you're learning what it was holding closed." He left without saying anything else. To his small credit, he never raised his voice at me, not once, all the way to the end. Men like Pierce don't get angry at load-bearing walls. They just stand in the rubble doing arithmetic. The 7 weeks that followed were, on my side of the wall, quiet and professional. The board, and by the board I mean Cyrus Queevell, whose objection was sitting right there in the October minutes like a loaded mousetrap, forced through the emergency hire of an interim chief inspector from a consultancy in Tulsa, a 59-year-old woman named Odessa Crane, with 30 years of certificates and stamps to her name. Exactly the hire they should have made if they'd ever needed to make one at all. I gave Odessa everything: the manual history, the surveillance file, the unwritten map of which FSDO contact preferred email, and which one preferred you pick up the phone. I did it because the people on that hangar floor deserve an airworthy quality system regardless of what the executive suite deserved, and because the traveling public was never, ever going to pay for Pierce Lockhart's tuition. Not on my certificate. Not on my last 7 weeks. Dawn resigned 3 weeks after I did. 2 senior inspectors followed her inside the month. The special emphasis inspection began in late March and did exactly what Gus said it would. The agency asked the dashboard for its source documents. The dashboard's links worked 60% of the time, and a document request list landed that took the depleted records team 8 weeks to satisfy. My last day was a Thursday in March. I walked the long way out, through both hangars, and shook hands at toolboxes I'd been standing next to since some of those mechanics were apprentices. Somebody in the engine shop had taped a sign to a workbench that said, "The scar tissue abides," and I'd be lying if I told you that didn't get me. The executive floor, when I passed it, was glass-walled conference rooms full of lawyers. Tanner was not in the building. He had been quietly reassigned to strategic initiatives, and his LinkedIn, a few months later, would announce his exciting new chapter at a self-storage investment platform in Scottsdale. I hope he's good at it. I mean that without teeth. The kid was never the disease. He was just the symptom his uncle hired. 3 blocks from the field, my phone buzzed. Maeve had timed the press release for that exact afternoon. O'Donnell Aviation Group announces Curtis Vance as managing director. Repair station practice. Don Kessler joins as senior director. Margot had known about the timing. Maeve had called her, the two of them conspiring like sorority sisters. And when I got home, there was a sheet cake on the kitchen table with a frosting airplane on it that our daughter had FaceTimed in from College Station to watch me see. The rest I learned the way everybody in a small industry learns everything, over coffee at conferences and in the public record. Because FAA enforcement and certificate actions are public record. The special emphasis inspection closed in July with findings that downgraded the agency's risk assessment of Brazos and extended enhanced surveillance another 2 years. The certificate amendment stayed deferred through the contract deadline. On July 2nd, Transgulf Airways exercised its walkaway clause and announced its heavy maintenance was going to the competitor in Alabama, a station whose press release pointedly cited its long-standing, unblemished certificate history. $38 million, plus options, gone to Mobile. Pierce Lockhart's resigned in September. The announcement said he was pursuing new opportunities, which I suppose was technically true of every minute of his life going forward. The board, Cyrus chaired the search, replaced him with a woman who had run repair stations for 25 years, which is the resume they should have been reading the first time. I'm told her opening all hands in Hangar 2 was 4 minutes long and ended with, "The certificate is the company, everything else is furniture." I'm told the hangar floor applauded. I'd have liked to have heard that. Margot's August scans came back clean. So did the next set. We drove down to the Gulf in October, first real vacation in 3 years, and I watched her stand in the wind at Port Aransas laughing at the pelicans, and I thought about how the worst stretch of your life and the proof of what your life was worth can be the same 14 months wearing different shirts. People who hear this story call it revenge. I've stopped correcting them in conversation, but I'll correct it here, once for the record. Revenge is when you cause the outcome. I didn't cause anything. I wrote a resignation letter and delivered it to the addresses the law required, with the attachments the law required, on the timeline the law required. Every consequence after that was the system functioning as designed. A system built, piece by piece, out of accidents and near misses and one badly documented stabilizer in 2012, specifically to stop men like Pierce Lockhart from finding out at altitude what they should have learned on the ground. What Pierce lost was never really the $38 million. What he lost was 13 years of one stubborn man choosing to stay put and build something boring and invisible and load-bearing. That kind of asset doesn't show up in a pitch deck. You can't buy it in a roll-up, you can't dashboard it, and you cannot hand it to your nephew. You only find out it was holding the wing on after you've drilled it out. When you're standing on the ramp, watching the inspector take out her mechanical pencil, and the structure starts to tell you, rivet by rivet, everything it was quietly carrying all along. Mardo keeps the photo from Porter Rancis on the refrigerator now, the one where the wind has her scarf halfway off and she's laughing anyway. I look at it most mornings while the coffee brews, and I think about how close I came to making every decision that year out of fear instead of patience. 14 months of her treatment, a tuition bill every semester, a CEO calling my life's work scar tissue. Fear was available to me every single day. It would have been so easy to scream at Pierce in that corner office, to leak something, to slam a door on the way out, and it would have ruined everything because anger spends in seconds what character builds in decades. Here's what I actually believe happened, stripped of the revenge talk. Pierce Lockhart planted a cause, and the cause grew its effect, the way causes do, indifferent to anyone's quarterly targets. He cut out the thing he didn't understand, and the structure responded exactly as structures respond. I didn't push him. I just declined to catch him. There's a difference, and I've made peace with the difference. The regulations that froze his $38 million were written in the blood and near misses of people who came before both of us. He treated them as friction. They were the floor. What carried me through wasn't cleverness, though knowing that 2012 agreement cold certainly mattered. Knowledge without a conscience is just a sharper knife, and a conscience without staying power folds the first time the pressure comes. I needed all three, and I needed them in order. Doing right came first, handing Odessa everything she needed, working every day of my notice, keeping the hangar floor safe no matter what the executive suite deserved, because the people on those airplanes never signed up for anyone's tuition. Understanding came second. 13 years of actually learning my craft instead of learning to perform it, so that when the moment arrived, I knew exactly which paragraph was load-bearing, and grit held the other two together. The discipline to smile in September, document in October, say nothing in November, and let the system work in January, all while my wife wore a scarf to chemotherapy and I tracked our savings on a spreadsheet I never showed her. If you're sitting where I sat, passed over, talked down to, watching somebody's nephew photograph your work with an iPad, I won't tell you it doesn't burn. It burns. But the cause you plant in that moment is the only thing you control. Plant rage and you'll harvest rubble, some of it yours, plain's honest work, real understanding, and the stubbornness to wait, and the harvest comes whether anyone's watching or not. Mine came on a Thursday in March, 3 blocks from the field, when my phone buzzed with a press release, and somewhere behind me a man was doing arithmetic in the ruins of his own decisions. The wing stays on because somebody boring chose to stay put and do it right for 13 years. Be the boring somebody. The structure remembers.